The Decatur Book Festival is a nonprofit. It depends on sponsors and donations to bring great authors to Decatur every year. Please consider a tax-deductible donation to support the festival by going to the festival website, www.decaturbookfestival.com. Lastly, please everyone take a moment to make sure their cell phones are on silent. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to first introduce our moderator. Her name is Susan Beckham Zurenda. She is the author of an award-winning Southern literary novel, Bells for Eli. Her second novel, The Girl from the Red Rose Motel, has won several awards. Please welcome Susan. Our first author is seated here. This is Karen Spears Zacharias. She is an American writer whose work focuses on women and justice. Her new book is No Perfect Mothers. Welcome, Karen. Next, we have Terah Shelton Harris. She has a collection of development librarian. She is a collection development librarian based in Alabama and a freelance writer. She has been published in Women's Health, Every Day with Rachel Ray, and many other publications. Her novel is Long After We Are Gone. Please welcome Terah. And last but not least, we have Jeffrey Blount. He's an award-winning author of 3 novels. He is also an Emmy award-winning television director and a documentary scriptwriter. His new book is Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way. Please welcome Jeffrey. With that, I'm going to turn it over to your moderator, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, and can you all hear me? Is it working? Okay. Thank all of you for being here. We are all Southern fiction writers, and you all are in for a treat in hearing about these authors' 3 novels. So I'm going to give just a little brief introduction, and then I'm going to ask each of them to give a 1-minute summary of their novel, and then I'll ask them some questions. I would say that the Southern novels featured on this panel, all of them, revolve around characters who are oppressed or ground down, you might say, by their circumstances. Whether it's, my character, Hazel, who lives in the dilapidated Red Rose Motel with her family, or the poverty-stricken citizens of Ham, Mississippi, who are striving to survive in Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way, or the 4 Solomon siblings who are holding out against greedy developers trying to seize their land in Long After We Are Gone. Or real life Carrie Buck, who is forced into sterilization as a young woman after giving birth in No Perfect Mothers. All of these characters are strong and they are resilient, and we admire them, or you will when you read about them. Against all odds, these characters engage us deeply, I think, in their struggle for human dignity and worth. And so I guess, Karen, since you're sitting next to me, start and tell us about No Perfect Mothers, and then we'll move to Terah.
Is this already on? There you go. I don't have to turn it on. Thank you all for coming out. Do you not just love the Decatur Book Festival? I have missed it so much. So thank you all for bringing it back and supporting it. The story of Carrie Buck is a historical fiction story from the 1920s about a young girl from North Carolina, or Virginia, sorry. North Carolina's been on my mind this week. From Virginia that was part of what became the eugenics movement, if you're familiar with that, where the U.S. Attorneys fought to win the right in the state of Virginia to sterilize men and women against their will or without their permission and often without their knowledge. And when I learned of the story, I realized that several nonfiction books had been written about it, but nobody had ever told the story of the 17-year-old girl at the heart of the SCOTUS case that led to forced sterilization. And it seemed to echo with me in our current political climate. Who has control over our bodies?
Hello. I'll say, is this thing on? Hello. Thank you guys so much for being here. And I want to say that this is my first event after being named the Target Author of the Year. Thank you so much. And I love that I get to talk about this book because this is the book of my heart. And so this book, Long After We're Gone, tells the story of 4 siblings who are each grappling with their own individual struggles and demons, who must return home after their father dies to save their ancestral home and land from being sold out from underneath them. And so it's an intergenerational trauma. It's a Southern fiction novel, but it's upmarket. And it's an intergenerational trauma story that really speaks to the power of family, and the power of letting go of things that no longer serve you, and the detriment of miscommunication. There's so much miscommunication in this book. There's so many messy stories. And so I want to write a messy family drama. And so you have 4 siblings, Junior, who's the eldest, who is technically responsible for the land after the passing of their father, but wants nothing to do with this land. And he's married and has 2 children. But his secret is, and all of these siblings are harboring these secrets, and his secret is that he is secretly in love with another man. And then you have Cece, who is the eldest daughter, who is very much like her brother. She not only wanted nothing to do with the land, but she also wanted nothing to do with the area where she's from. And so she made herself these promises that she was going to become a lawyer and move away and become this top lawyer in New York. And she did that. Except her secret is that she has secretly embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars away from her law firm. And then you have Mance, who is the second son, who is exactly like his father, opposite of his brother. And he loves this land, but he suffers from anxiety and a temper problem that has landed him in prison more than once. So you can just about imagine how he feels about this land that he loves so much being taken away from him. And then lastly, you have Toki, who's the youngest daughter, who, unlike the other siblings, has never really felt in with her family. And so she struggles with that, and she fills that void using some very self-destructive manners. And so this is a book about the power of family and also letting go of things that no longer serve you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to the Decatur Book Festival for having me, and thank you guys for coming out. Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way is a story of an African-American billionaire who is quite famous and is a great philanthropist. And he suffers an incredibly embarrassing, high-profile fall from grace. And in an attempt to outrun traditional media and social media, he runs to the rural South. And that's where he's from. He grew up there, and this is sort of like running away to escape all of the city and all the people and try to find himself again. Well, he buys a house online, sight unseen, drives up to this house and finds out that he has bought a house that's adjacent to a neighborhood that is mired in abject poverty. He doesn't want to have anything to do with his neighborhood because he's got his own business to try to right, but he gets drawn into this community. And the book follows his attempt to find some personal redemption, but it also follows his attempt to save this community from collapsing onto itself after a very, very difficult, shocking, and hurtful discoveries made in the community. So this book is about redemption, but most importantly, this book is about us recognizing our fellow human beings who exist in something called social death. And this is sort of a new psychological theory, and I have picked a piece out of it because it helps me explain this book about those of us who we can leave in these patterns of poverty and the things that occur with the poverty, lack of healthcare, lack of education, lack of government support, and all of those things, we can leave them in a state of social death, meaning they can't reach outside of their community and better themselves. They're in a place where there is, it's a food desert, it's an education desert, it's all kinds of deserts. And because we don't reach, because we have such busy lives and have chosen to move on, we leave them in this social death. Well, Mr. Jimmy falls into this, and with his business acumen, his wealth, he has a struggle because it doesn't come easy to him to try and help these folks. Now, I'm talking about there's a lot of issues here, but it's also a book full of love. It's also a book that'll make you laugh in the midst of all of these things. So that's Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way.
Thank you. I like that term, Jeffrey. I haven't heard you use that before, social death, because I think that's true of all of the novels that, are represented among us, is that all of these characters may not be facing quite the same kind of social death, but thank you for bringing that term to me. Okay, so you've sort of alluded to this a little bit in your summaries, but let me ask, what was the inspiration for your novel? Or another way, I guess, of putting it is to say, how did the idea originate with you? Karen, you start, and then I'll go backward in a minute.
So the idea came to me during COVID. I actually live in Oregon, though I grew up down here in Columbus, Georgia. So I often read the Atlanta Journal-Constitution online, and I opened up the Atlanta Journal online one day, and I read about a case out of South Georgia at a migrant detention center in an area that I was familiar with, had been to. And the story was that there was an OBGYN in that migrant detention center who was sterilizing young women without their permission and often without their knowledge and at a high rate. And it had been a young mother of 5 woman out of Tifton, Georgia, who was a nurse at this facility who did the whistleblowing of this event. And I was a journalist by training, and I was shocked to know that I knew nothing about this kind of sterilization taking place currently. And I didn't know the history of sterilization. I didn't know how much of it had occurred. Over 70,000 Americans, some of them currently living, who had been sterilized, as young as 10, 11, 12 years old, and being told that what they call the Mississippi appendectomy, being told that they were getting appendectomies. So it was really a headline story in the Atlanta Journal that sent me down the path of the Carrie Buck story.
It's just stunning to me.
Stunning.
I've read all these books, and you just can't believe it that human beings are treated that way.
Yeah, the overarching message for me, though, in all of that was that it took this mother of 5 who risked her job, what I call the unlikely friend. We all have an unlikely friend in our lives, somebody who's come along and aided us and helped us and in a time that maybe we knew we needed or maybe we didn't know we needed. Jeffrey has unlikely friends in his book as well. So those unlikely helpers, and that this woman who had these 5 children to support, a Black woman who then befriends these Hispanic women and rats out the doctor, who, by the way, wasn't even a board certified OBGYN, it came to light. So she loses her job, but he still works. And, just the total injustice of that, but the fact that there are the most and we're seeing this in Appalachia right now. My family's from East Tennessee, so I'm hearing the stories daily. But we all benefit from helpers in our lives, unlikely helpers.
Indeed, we do.
So, very much like you, Karen, the inspiration for this book I stumbled upon by accident. I was finishing my first book one summer in Savannah, and I was reading this article in the New Yorker about two brothers, Melvin Davis and Curtis Reels of North Carolina, and who went to jail for 8 years after they refused to leave the land that their great-grandfather had purchased 100 years prior, after it was sold out from underneath them without their knowledge or consent. And when I was reading this article, and when I finished, I was so angry and frustrated, not only at what happened to them, but that I had never heard of this term before, heir property. Never heard of this term, heir property. I was a librarian for 18 years. And so this sent me down a spiral of research because I just cannot believe that I've never heard of land loss with this term. I've heard of eminent domain, but I'd never heard of heir property. And so it sent me down the spiral of doing more and more research. And what I discovered was heir property is a form of ownership in which descendants inherit interest in the land. So it's very similar to holding like stock in a company. But there's so many problems with this. And so when an heir dies and without a will, his property or their property becomes heir property. And so I thought, okay. And so there are so many problems with heir property. One of the main problems is there is no title or deed to prove an ownership to this land. And so there's no piece of paper. So you can't prove ownership. And that's, I mean, think about it. When you need to prove ownership, you can't, without that, you can't get a loan. You can't, nothing on this land. And so because of that, that makes it very vulnerable for businesses and corporations to come in and basically steal it from underneath them. And that's what happened. But it's also because heir property, because the laws, some of these laws for heir property has been sitting on the books for hundreds of years. And depending on the state that you live in, because this land is passed down via heir property, there could be a lot of heirs to just one particular piece of property. I mean, I was doing some research and I discovered that this one person I was talking to, there was 100 heirs to like 1 acre of land. Could you imagine that? And so in some states, it only takes one of those 100 heirs in order to sell for all the land to be lost altogether. And that is what happened with the two brothers, Melvin Davis and Curtis Reels in North Carolina. And that's what happens in my book as well. And so I knew then, because I'd never heard this term, that I wanted to raise some awareness to this topic and how it's still affecting quite a few people today.
Well, I'm going to say I'm like Karen also, because you mentioned COVID. Mr. Jimmy from around the way is my COVID baby. That's what I refer to him as. Right. And so when I spent 34 years working at NBC News as a director, and over the years, you want to say you're objective and you wouldn't want to say that you're an activist for something. But as I left NBC, I had loved writing all my life and knew I wanted to write. But I also knew now I wanted to be a literary activist, that I wanted my books to mean something and speak to something. And so when COVID happened, I had been thinking about all these things that were on my mind, stories that we'd done at NBC News from about healthcare and all these other issues. My wife was a CNN correspondent. We're sitting on the back porch, and she was reminding me of when she had gotten lost with her crew in Louisiana. And she called from the road and said, I cannot believe that this kind of poverty, which I have stumbled upon, exists in the United States of America. And it shook her. And we were sitting on our back porch during COVID, and this came up. And I said, this crystallizes it for me. I know that this is what I need to do now. This is the next piece of activism that I need to tell. And so I started reflecting upon those issues, the healthcare and the education and all that. Each one of those could be its own book. But then I created Ham, Mississippi. And I know that in any community where you have this kind of poverty, all of these issues will be represented somehow. And that I could make a statement about all of those issues by using this one community. And over time, as I wrote this book, a lot of times my previous books have come to me in one, I call them light bulb moments. It just happens and I'm gone. Well, Mr. Jimmy was piece by piece. Things would come to me. My daughter and I went to hear a speaker who just one quote in the speak, Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative, turned me in another direction. And when I couldn't find the person that I needed to find to go to Ham, Mississippi and make a change, I stumbled upon an article by Robert Smith, who is the wealthiest black person in the United States, who's worth about $6 or $7 billion. And having him at that time go through kind of a fall from grace. And I thought, well, this isn't exactly who I want, but this is the skeleton to make Mr. Jimmy. So all during COVID, I'm taking these bits and pieces and adding them together to create the story that presents some issues that I think that we as Americans need to understand and deal with. You know, their Doctors Without Borders was created, right, to help in developing countries. Well, you should know it is now working in the United States of America.
Thank you. Wow, I thought I kind of knew the inspiration for your novels, but I just learned things I did not know. And my book too was born out of COVID. But anyway, since we are on a Southern literature panel, Jeffrey, tell us in what ways, and I think you've just alluded to it, about the abject poverty in your town of Ham, Mississippi. It's Southern, but in what ways is a Southern setting significant, or what grounds your novel in the Southern experience?
Well, I think the Southern novel is specific to me, that I need to work out some things. So Flannery O'Connor said, if you survived a Southern childhood, you will never run out of material.
And that's
So-
true.
It is true.
So I think part of this is me having to work out this material. I got to get through this stuff. Another reason is when I was working at NBC, it got to the point where people would associate the word urban with black. And I would have to say to producers all the time, wait a minute, you can't just say urban and mean black. And they would stare at you and you say, but I grew up on a farm in Virginia. There are black people who live all in the South, who live in rural situations, in very different situations in Washington and New York and LA. And so part of me wants to go back to the South and write those stories to make people recognize that we are still here. And our stories are often different. And so I wanted to do that. And the other part is, I think that at a certain point in my life, I do it with the music. You know, I feel like I regressed. I stopped moving ahead with different kinds of music, and I found myself listening to the music that was with me when I became Jeffrey, when I was growing up and becoming me. And when I sit down to write and I want to tell you these stories, I want to tell you them from my heart and from a place where I became who I am. And that is in the South. In the culture, the language, the humidity, all of it.
Yes.
All of it, it is in me. And when I sit down to write, no matter what it starts out being, it comes home to the South.
And it is all there in Mr. Jimmy from around the way. I'll guarantee you. Terah?
Well, this book is rooted in the South because of what I discovered in my research about air property and the reason why this land was passed down via air property. Because I couldn't wrap my head around, why are we passing our land down via air property without a will? Why are we doing this? And so I put my librarian hat on, did research, and it led me all the way back to the Reconstruction, when after the Reconstruction, formerly enslaved Americans began buying up a lot of land. But, you know, we lived in a different time then. And so unfortunately, at the same time they were buying this land, laws and policies were created to dispossess them of their land. And so at a time when a lot of these formerly enslaved Americans could not read or write, they also did not trust that they could walk into a Southern court and what was presented in front of them was the title and deed to their land. So passing their land down via air property was the best solution for them at the time. They had no idea that hundreds of years later, that these same laws would be sitting on the books. And so they needed to make a change. And so air property is everywhere. I met a woman who had air property in New York state, but the reason of air property is really rooted in the South because of this. They didn't have the same problems. I asked her, I said, why do you have air property? And she says, oh, my grandfather just didn't want a will. So it was by choice for him. But unfortunately, it wasn't by choice for a lot of these formerly enslaved Americans in the South. So I want to be true to the most reason why this land was passed down this way.
And I think, too, and it's so obvious and wonderful in Terah's book, you know, Southerners, they love their land. And this family though they have some conflict with each other about keep it, don't keep it, you'll feel it. This love of land and their father, King, has instilled that in them. And that's, I think, I'm sure it's true in other parts of the world too, but by golly, I know it's true in the South.
Of course, for me, it was fairly easy because it's historical fiction. The Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell, took place in the state of Virginia. Now, before the Supreme Court case came along in 1924, Virginia was already sterilizing people. But the person that propelled forward the Buck v. Bell Supreme Court case was the superintendent of the colony there in Charlottesville they called it the Virginia colony for the epileptics and feeble-minded. These colonies existed all across the U.S. They've been renamed or repurposed since then, but almost every state had one, if not more than one. And so Carrie, who was a foster child at age 4, was placed in a home that, as she grew up, they used her as a domestic to make money. And so she was pulled out of school. Now they had segregated homes for the feeble-minded and the epileptic at the time. So Carrie's particular home is for whites, but she was labeled as being an imbecile, not because she was in any way an imbecile. We know this. We actually have writings from Carrie, but because she was uneducated. And there's a big difference. And as you said, Terah, it's a matter of you can't make a will if you don't know how to write or if you don't know how to read. My family is from Appalachia. I had 2 grandfathers, neither of which ever drove. And I didn't know until I was a young married woman that my paternal grandfather was illiterate. The way I found this out is I took him shopping for my grandmother. It was her 70th birthday. And I said, Pap, pick out a card. And he said, you pick one out. And I thought, no, Pap, just pick out any card. And so he picks out a card and he signs it Mr. Howard Spears to his wife of, decades. And I was like, then it hit me. He can't sign anything else. That's all he knows to write. And of course, with Carrie, she grew up in this environment where when you're a foster child, this is even true today, certainly true with the migrant situation, she had no voice. And it wasn't because she couldn't have a voice, but she was denied a voice. And so I have a saying on the back of my Jeep. I drive around in Oregon. It says, he who controls what you read controls what you think, or if you think. And that Oregon, I found out during my research, was the last state in the 1980s to formally drop forced sterilization. And you think of Oregon as being a very progressive state, but we were the last state to do it. That's not to say it's not still happening. It is still happening. We just kind of don't make the headlines about it as the way it did during COVID. So,
and I think you pointed out, Jeffrey, that sometimes, we have some big cities in the South, but primarily the South. I live in South Carolina. It's primarily a rural state, And when you have rural people who are just as important as any other people, they're not, perhaps they are silenced more.
Oh, I agree. You
Yeah.
say it perfectly. They
Yeah,
don't have a voice.
than
We took
others.
it away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which kind of leads me into the next question. When you're a writer, this is a strange thing that happens, but you become affected by your own characters. I mean, I was affected by my characters in The Girl from the Red Rose Motel. I mean, among other things, I learned that people who are very different from one another, if they're in genuine relationships, then it fosters growth and empathy and change. And so I want to ask you all, how were you affected by these characters, primarily rural, even though Cece has lived in New York? How are you affected by your own characters whom you created, either in a general way or with an individual character?
Well, my husband says, stop telling people this. But
But I'm going to tell you.
when I write, I don't see scenes when I write. I hear voices. And so he's like, stop telling people that. But my characters speak to me. And so people always are very curious about how we put together these characters. Well, they tell me. They tell me who they are, what they look like, what profession they have, and whatever they're suffering from. And so a lot of times I don't know about these things. So for example, Toki in the book, she's an overeater. She's an emotional overeater. I'm not an emotional overeater. And so it forces me to do research on those topics and what is overeating in order for me to get that right. And then it seeks me out to go speak to someone who's willing to share their experience with being an emotional overeater. And then that I begin to have empathy for that character. And even after the book is done, I still understand, oh, wow, it's an emotional overeater. I understand that. It has that empathy stays with you long after you type the end on your book. And so even for Mance he suffers from anxiety. What is that like to suffer from anxiety? He literally in the 3rd chapter, he has a panic attack in a hospital room. He has a panic attack. And what does that feel like for people? And so when I see people suffering from anxiety, I have that empathy for them. And so that's one of the things I love about these characters is that you guys read them and you learn from them, but we as the writers, we also learn from them too.
I will say that, first of all, Jeffrey, I love that you created a billionaire that I could feel empathetic about. I wrote him and said that. I would have never, in our current culture, ever think I would feel empathy for a billionaire. But Jeffrey made me kind of feel bad for this guy. So that's really good writing. For me, during part of the writing of No Perfect Mothers, which, by the way, I have 4 children and they all agree. I was living in Scotland, studying in Scotland, and I thought a lot about what the young women in South Georgia had done for these migrants. And I wondered who were the unlikely friends of Carrie's life, because we have no historical documentation that she had anything but the most, sad life, no voice, and her rights taken away from her. And even in the courts where she's asked, she defers to a lawyer who was appointed to her because he believed in eugenics. So I had no evidence that she had an unlikely friend, so I created one. And I created a character named Mora, who is a midwife. And Mora is a biracial woman who grew up partly in Scotland and then partly in Virginia. And so I give her that friend that I always wish Carrie had.
And were you affected by Mora yourself?
Yes. I base Mora. I happened to be traveling in Scotland with a poet, E.J. Wade, out of Chicago. And Ellen, or E.J., is a woman of color, and she is very noticeable everywhere you go in Scotland. People noticed her. She's very queenly looking. And so I took some of Ellen's traits and embedded them in the character of Maura.
I think that my characters, much like Terah said, educated me in the sense that so I don't write with an outline, and I try to let the story and the characters come to me, and then they find themselves in situations where I need to then call a psychologist. And I'm working out things for them, and I'm working out things for me. But the psychologists, they educate me. It's like when you went to do your research on the property, then I went to do my research about what this thing I want to make happen to my character. Is it legit? Is it real? And then when I talk to the psychologist, I find out it's more than real, and here's something else I can add. And I learned something there. The same with there is something that requires a person to be charged in this book criminally. And so I went to a district attorney who then educated me further. And then I was able to grow and learn from that and become more empathetic for that. But I think one of the things that happens to me that I love about writing, that in the kind of books that I choose to write, is that it keeps me feeling human and good, because fiction creates empathy. We know that. It's a very powerful thing about fiction. And so, as Robert Frost said, there's no tears in the writer, there are no tears in the reader. So I find myself having no outline, writing these characters. All of a sudden, a situation comes up, and I find myself emotionally affected in a way that when I started writing that day, I would have never believed could have happened. And people have said to me, I've had to I put the book aside for a second and think about what you wrote. And I say, I put it aside to think about what I wrote also. Mm-hmm. And so that's when I know you and I have joined. And when you tell me that, I know we have met at the same place, exactly where I hoped we would meet. So that's how I think my characters affect me. They teach me, and then I become, and they become like family. And I may be the only one here, but this is the truth. I go into a grief mode when I finish. When you write the last word, they're gone. So you help bring them back. So when I'm here talking now, they come back to life. But I go through a period after a few days or a week or so where I have lost someone. So they teach me about living. They teach me about myself remaining human. And they teach me about loss and how important relationships are.
You bring up an excellent point. As much as we are affected by our characters, a book is not complete. The art is not complete, is it, until it has a reader?
Absolutely.
And we hope also the readers are affected by our characters.
Absolutely.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to jump to this sort of last concluding question and ask each of you, speaking of you readers, what you hope readers will hold on to or feel after they have read your novels.
Mr. Jimmy, as I told you, I like to think of myself as being an activist, a literary activist. Mr. Jimmy, the goal was I call it the activism of kindness. It's about us recognizing each other's humanity. I like to steal a little part from the UN statement that every human being is born free and equal in dignity and rights. And when you read Mr. Jimmy, what I hope happens is at the end of the book, when you close it, you feel that, and that you feel inspired to go out and do that. And I'll just say quickly, I was at an unlikely place, and I won't say the city, but it was an unlikely library in a place that I didn't think a library would exist. And I talked about Mr. Jimmy, the activism of kindness. At the end, a woman who probably was in her 80s stood up and she said, she started telling us about the problems in her life. And I thought, well, I can't leave here tonight after I just talked like this without doing anything. But before I can do anything, 3 people in the audience stood up to take care of her, and the librarian said, we are attached with a psychologist and a social worker that we can help you with. I saw it happening. And then the last thing I'll say is, I love this, is that I have never had a fictional book strike such a call to action in my soul before. So that's what Mr. Jimmy was for.
Wonderful. Thank you, Thank you, Jeffrey, for Mr. Jimmy.
Yeah, the call to action is it for me. When you close this book, and I want people to immediately start thinking about estate planning. And please, do you have a will? Can we please make sure you have a will? Ask questions. One of the biggest issues in this book and all the research that I did was people are passing away without wills. So let's make sure that we have wills. Also, if you think you have heir property, or if you have family land, a lot of people have family land. Turns out I've been married for 18 years, and the land that I am currently building a home on was heir property at one point, and my husband never told me that. And so he doesn't even know the history of it until I asked his mother. And so if you think you have family land, or you have family land, please make sure you take the steps to talk to the elders of your family and ask questions about that. Unfortunately, heir property is a problem that's continuing to happen today. When I talk about this book, people think that it's historical fiction. It's not historical fiction. This is a contemporary novel that's happening right now. And so when you close that book, I want you to think about estate planning and a call to action to make sure that the land that your family works so hard for stays in your family.
I think for me, the first time I heard literary activists was with Jeffrey when we were in Virginia. So I love that because obviously all 3 of us are involved in literary activism. And
Yes.
I love that Jeffrey's coined it because it gave me permission finally, because I started my career as a journalist and I write books, but my books all have a point. The last word that I use in No Perfect Mothers is vote. And the reason twofold. I lost my father in Vietnam. And I say, it's well and good to pay lip service to Gold Star families, but if you don't vote, you negate that sacrifice that they have made. Because they have done that for you. They have done that for all of us. And secondly, Carrie never got a voice, right? And if you don't vote, you are giving away that voice. Like she had it taken from her. But if you refuse to vote because you don't like either a candidate or you don't think you don't align with this policy or that, but if you refuse to vote, you give that voice away. So, literary activism.
And what I hope, and maybe this is a good concluding statement, that in my novel, that we remember the overwhelming capacity of love. Thank you all for coming, and we've had a good time.